Hi everybody, welcome to Automotive History with Giraffe. I'm your host, Giraffe. Today's episode we're going to cover the Ford Motor Company, given that the three Ford GT40s from Le Mans 66 just ran together at Goodwood a couple days ago. So, let's talk about Ford. So, Henry Ford himself was a tremendous businessman, very controversial figure, but incredible businessman. His first car he actually made in 1896. The quadricycle is what it's called. It was made with four bicycle wheels instead of, traditional car tires. Didn't have a reverse gear, fun fact. It had two forward gears, like low gear, high gear. And then to turn it around, you get in it, and you don't turn the wheel, you use the tiller to turn it. Because it had a tiller, quite similar to a boat. Um, so, at a certain point, about 5 years later, Henry Ford's made a couple more cars. He's failed at a couple of companies. And at this point in time, he says like, hey, this whole car, it's a whole new thing. It's supposed to be better than a horse and carriage, and I want to prove to the world that my cars are the best. So he takes one of his cars with an almighty 26 horsepower and races against this dude named Alexander Winton. Now Winton was a driver back in the early 1900s, and he was also a car builder. And when Henry Ford challenged him to a race, he had developed a 70 horsepower car. So they go out, they get racing, it's 10 laps on a mile oval, and Ford proceeds to win. Not because his car is more powerful, but because his car is more reliable. This proves to the world that his cars are more reliable than others, quite simply put. So of course, like at this time, Ford Motor Company, as we know it today, doesn't quite exist yet. But 2 years later, 1903, they would officially incorporate the Ford Motor Company. Um, Ford would actually partner with two famous people, John and Horace Dodge, who we'll talk about in a later episode of this series. And together, along with several other investors, they would go out and sell cars. So when um, Ford Motor Company Incorporated initially, they had a total of 100 shares. The Dodge brothers, I think, each got 10, if my memory serves me right. 1907 comes along. The traditional Ford Oval that we know today, with the typeface and all of that, is created. Wouldn't be used for another 20 years until the second generation Model A. Then the next year, 1908, the Model T is released after several years of development, with cars such as Model A, Model B, so on and so forth, all the way up to Model T. Model T would go on to be one of the best-selling American cars ever made. There were over 15 million of them released. It was the first car and the only car for 60 years to have sold over 10 million units, and at that over 15 million. It would only be surpassed by the Volkswagen Beetle in the 60s. So, later that year, 1908, this guy William Durant, who actually was the founder of GM, who we'll talk about, who I'll talk about in a later episode, offered to buy out Ford. So at the time, in the early 1900s, there was this guy named George Selden who had held a patent on the car as a whole. Like the whole internal combustion engine, that was kind of his thing. He patented it, and he was known for suing the heck out of people when it came to the motor car. So, in an effort to make an offer to help Ford combat Selden, William Durant offered to buy Ford the first time. Henry Ford said, well, no. If Selden wants war, we'll give him war. Right? About a year later, Durant would go on to offer to buy Ford again. And these figures are in 1909 dollars. Durant offered to buy Ford for $8 million. $2 million in stock and $6 million over the course of 3 years at 5% interest. And once again, Ford turned it down on the basis that he didn't want to sell it to General Motors. Didn't want to end up like Cadillac and Buick and Oldsmobile had done. Um, Durant was a notoriously terrible businessman, but again, more on him in a later episode. Famously, then in 1913, the moving assembly line is implemented at Ford. While it wasn't the original assembly line, that being created by Eli Olds, um, it was the first traditional moving assembly line that we see today in a lot of factories and plants and the like. Um, Ford, he kind of invented that. It was kind of part of the thing that, helped the mass production of the Model T. Um, and with that, in 1914, Ford created the $5 day, which doubled the pay rate at the time for workers. And while now, the minimum wage is a bit north of $7 today in the U.S., the $5 day back then was huge. You know, Ford also created the 5-day 40-hour work week that we see today, um, which cut hours, which allowed workers to spend time with their families on like a true weekend versus having a 6-day with God only knows how many hours worth of time that beforehand. 1917, sorry, back to 1914 real quick. The Dodge brothers actually leave Ford because of some disagreements with how they were with after disagreements with how Ford was running the company. Um, they weren't getting paid as of course both the brothers were stakeholders and they weren't getting paid as they had wanted to be paid. So they both left, started up the Dodge Motor Car Company, which again we'll get to that at a later time. But um, but the Dodge brothers both left Ford. They went and got their start with their company, and they went and did their thing. 1917, the world famous River Rouge complex is opened up, which allowed for even further production of Ford cars. And also, the first Ford pickup was released, the Model TT, as it was called, standing for ton truck. Um, yeah, it was based on the Model T platform, had upgraded axles and an upgraded engine, and it had a pretty good capacity to it, a ton. So then, 2 years later, 1919, a decently familiar name, Edsel Ford, comes to the presidency of the company, taking over from his father. Um, now, uh, both Henry Ford and Edsel Ford had major disagreements with each other. Back during the production of the Model T, Edsel had actually campaigned for the Model T to be equipped with hydraulic brakes, which were already being applied across the industry. GM was doing it, and Chrysler Corporation was doing it. Everybody was doing it besides Ford. So Edsel went into one of Ford's top engineers, William Knutson, who will come back later. And both Edsel and William Knutson went into Henry Ford's office to try to convince him that hydraulic brakes were the way of the future. Henry Ford and his head of security, Harry Bennett, brushed them off, and Ford ended up actually firing Knutson, which ended up leading to a whole other series of events I'll get to here in a little bit. But so that specific instance led to a lot of animosity between Edsel and Henry the First. They did eventually go on to apply hydraulic brakes within the Model T, but they kept using mechanical brakes, which were a lot more prone to uneven wear and other various problems within the car. So eventually, Edsel did convince Henry Ford that it was necessary to put hydraulic brakes in, and they went with it. So that was a good thing that came out of that. A couple years later, 1922, Ford actually buys Lincoln. So Lincoln was actually, funny enough, derived from an older Ford brand that Ford had made. I can't remember which one, but at the time that they bought it, it was owned by this guy named Henry Leland. So Ford bought it, created it into Lincoln. They went on to make some pretty iconic cars in the 20s and 30s, such as the Lincoln Zephyr and the first generation Lincoln Continental. And the Continental, of course, is a nameplate that's very famous. that's the kind of car that JFK was shot and killed in. But that wouldn't be until the 60s when that happened. 1925 comes around, and Ford says, hey, let's get into the pretty newly formed airline industry. As, Ford was known for being very thinking forward, besides the whole, mechanical versus hydraulic brakes thing. So 1925, the Ford Tri-Motor plane enters production. This is actually a pretty interesting setup, even by today's airplane standards. It was a triple propeller motor plane with one propeller on the nose and two on the wings. On more modern tri-motor planes, there's usually one per wing and one in the tail fin, whereas having one in the nose, just due to safety things. Then a couple years later after that, in 1927, the second generation Ford Model A, aka the AA, the Model AA, enters production actually at Edsel Ford's advisement. As a deal like, hey, we've made a Model T. It was wicked successful for us, but we want to go on, move forward, keep advancing the technologies, and keep moving forward, if you will. And that went on to be hugely successful. People, of course, had known the Ford nameplate from the Model T, and the Model T didn't change much between 1917 and 1927 when the Model AA came out. But when the AA came out, it had it had more power, was more comfortable, easier. It was a lot easier to drive, and it was just an overall benefit for Ford. A couple years later, 1932, Ford actually drops the now famous flathead V8. So flathead was used in a lot of different things, like the old F100s and a bunch of the old hot rods. Use the flathead, and it's a very popular engine, very strong engine, very reliable, and very, very widely used. There's a whole bunch of different parts that are available for it in modern day. 6 years after that, the Mercury Motor Company is introduced as a kind of mid-range to sit between the affordable Ford and the kind of overly expensive Lincolns at the time, right? Bear in mind that at this point in time, the Great Depression is happening, so do with that what you will. Business wasn't very great at the time because nobody had any money because the New York Stock Exchange had just crashed a couple years earlier. So that happened. 1941 comes along, and of course we don't know what happened then. The Japanese go bomb Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, USA, and the U.S. enters World War II. So Ford actually comes up with Ford creates the original actually design for the Jeep, and of course the original Jeeps all had tractor engines from Ford, and because yes, Ford also made tractors. Eventually, the design would go on to have a Willys engine put into it. That was a whole lawsuit that ensued with that, but they ramped up Jeep production for World War II because troops were getting deployed to Europe and Africa and to the Pacific Front, and they all needed a reliable way to get around. Additionally, the United Auto Workers contract was signed after many years of conflicts with Ford, including, but not limited to, the infamous Ford Massacre. That was led by Harry Bennett, Ford's personal head of security. 5 people were killed in that massacre. I would definitely recommend looking into it if you get the chance. It's a part of Ford's history that they won't really talk about because, obvious reasons. But it's a bit of an important part, or it's a bit of an important thing to know from their history. And of course, there was a whole line of secession fiasco with Harry Bennett and Edsel because Henry Ford himself always saw Harry Bennett as more of a son figure than he ever saw Edsel as. Um, let's see what happens. 1942, full production was diverted to military equipment. So instead of making passenger cars, they had entirely converted all their factories to military operations. Fun fact, actually, 70% of all the B-24s from World War II came from Ford's factory. They were churning out one of them every 63 minutes. You will hear the character of Henry Ford II mention this in Ford versus Ferrari. But yeah, the Ford Motor Company was a huge supplier of military equipment during World War II. The next year, 1943, Mr. Edsel Ford dies of stomach cancer. There's a bit of an urban legend that may or may not be true, but it is often told that Henry Ford worked Edsel to the point where he developed stomach cancer and just died. At this point, Henry Ford II is actually sent home by a certain General William Knudsen from earlier, who, was friends with Edsel. So there was actually a whole fiasco that happened, um, where Hank Ford, of course, Ford II, wanted, to stay deployed, wanted to finish out his contract with the military, and Knudsen pretty much told him, hey, listen, it is in the country's best interest that you go and take over this company from your Looney Tune of a grandfather. Because Henry I wasn't particularly known for being he was a great businessman, kind of not a great person. A little bit of a Looney Tune there toward the end. But Knudsen sent Henry IV II home so that he could help run the company. Then a couple years later, 1945, he ascends to the presidency, this being Henry II. Under his presidency, a lot of things happened. The F Series was introduced alongside the Shoebox Ford, 1948. 1954, the Thunderbird is introduced as well. And of course, that was originally released to combat the C-1 Corvette, which Corvette video coming soon as well. But Thunderbird, it ended up actually more diverting from the traditional C1 Corvette, more toward more toward Lincoln Continental. Yeah, back in the 60s they actually shared a frame or back in the 80s, excuse me, they shared like a frame and all of that. So the whole downfall of Thunderbird needs to be studied. But yeah, a couple years later after that, in 1956, Ford IPOs comes at that point in time the largest IPO in history. Of course, we witnessed another one of those fairly recently with SpaceX, but at the time it was the largest in history. The same year, 1956, the Lincoln Continental Mark II is released. So this is more similar to what JFK rode in when he was killed. 1957, the questionable Edsel line was introduced. They were way ahead of their time, almost to a fault, in the same way that the Chrysler Airflow was about 20 years prior. They just, way too much technology, not enough demand for said technology quite yet in time, and all that happened. About 5 years later after that, in 1962, a certain Carroll Shelby approaches Lee Iacocca to use Ford engines in his Cobras. Cobra video probably coming next weekend. Or Shelby video, more accurately. But, so what happened with that is that Iacocca gave him some old 260 engines, these being a 260 cubic inch V8, because those were the outgoing models. They were quite outdated. They were older design. And of course, this happened because the next year, 1963, the 289 cubic inch V8 released. And of course, Ford didn't want to give Shelby their brand new engines. like were in development, right? So they gave Shelby 10 of these free 260 cubic inch engines and let him go play with those. Um, so anywho, yeah, 1963, the 289 cubic inch V8 is released in the Fairlanes, and those were wildly successful engines and like just general driving and racing and everything. Um, the same year, very famously, Ferrari denies Ford's purchase. So this is a lot of where the Ford versus Ferrari timeline comes in, is right here. Um, so then that next year, 1964, the Mustang's released with I think it was a 215 cubic inch inline six or the 289 V8. The same year, the GT40 program is started to go combat Ferrari at Le Mans. Of course, at this time, the Cobras and the Cobras mainly were over in Europe already, giving Ferrari a run for their money. Again, more on that next weekend or next episode. But yeah, then of course 2 years later, after much more development to the GT40s, the three GT40s that just ran at Goodwood together, chassis P/1046, first place car driven by McLaren Neyman. The second place car was P/1015, and the third place car P/1016. Those three together all ran at Le Mans and won it together, very famously. There's a lot of debate online, about the second place car driven by Ken Miles and Denny Hulme, supposedly having won the race. If you look up a picture of the '66 Le Mans finish line, the McLaren Amon car is very clearly ahead at that line, right? So the movie Ford vs Ferrari doesn't really show that part accurately. Ken Miles didn't really know his positioning on track, according to several sources close to him. But yeah, I mean, the McLaren Amon car did win outright. Now, that being said, both of the top two finishing cars, the McLaren Amon and the Miles Hulme car, were both entered into that race by Shelby American. The car that finished third, the bronze number 5 chassis P1016, was run by Holman Moody, who was NASCAR team, who Ford had selected to help run. But yeah, I mean, people say that, that Miles should have won. The McLaren Amon car was very clearly ahead at the finish line. Look up literally any picture of it. And it's not the picture where, the top two are side by side. That's a bit later down the start finish straight. Anywho, off of that tangent. 4 years later, after Ford has completely destroyed Ferrari at Le Mans for 4 years on the trot, they actually then implemented the 3-point seatbelt. Of course, that was very famously created by Volvo and just given out for free, and the licenses for that patent were just given out for free. And yeah, I mean, it's insane a little bit that, Ford proceeded to win Le Mans 4 times in a row before they implemented 3-point seatbelts into their passenger cars. About 6 years after that, the Ford Fiesta is actually rolled out. The first gen Ford Fiesta is rolled out. And, that's obviously a very popular car, especially over in Europe nowadays. It sold a little bit on the American market. It was removed after some point in the late 2010s. But it remains a very popular model over in Europe. 1980, Philip Caldwell was appointed the chairman and CEO of Ford. Caldwell was the first person who to serve as chairman and CEO who wasn't a member of the Ford family. Bear in mind, we had Henry Ford to start off, and then we had Edsel, and then Henry Ford II, Hank Ford. And that was a whole big thing. Um, you know. Then 1981, that next year, the very famous Escort received its fifth generation. Now, of course, the Escort had existed for many years prior to this. It had done some very successful stints in rally racing, actually, and a little bit in touring cars as well, I think. But the fifth generation was rolled out very globally. It was meant to be a very global platform. Of course, and then skip a few years, nothing much really happens in the 80s. Fox Body Mustangs released at some point during the 80s. I can't remember exactly what year. But yeah, that's the thing. Um, then 1990, the next big thing happens. The Ford Explorer is introduced as a kind of like, small to mid-size SUV. And of course, here's where we get the whole Firestone tire saga with, you know, the tires kind of acting as grenades and blowing out at whatever speed they want to. And this whole lawsuit, Ford blaming Firestone, Firestone was blaming Ford. They'd had a partnership for a long time because Henry Ford the First and Harvey Firestone, I believe his name was, who created Firestone tires, were good friends. And Ford pretty much, or didn't exclusively, but the majority of Ford products all used Firestone tires because of that long-standing tradition. Um, of course, having known each other. So they did all of that. There was a whole lawsuit that ensued, and they ended up splitting ways because of that. 1993, Ford decided, hey, let's roll out another global platform, and they decided to roll out the Mondeo and Contour platform. Of course, most places around the world know it as the Mondeo. The US got it as the Contour. There's also a special SVT Contour that Ford made. Of course, there's the same SVT team that did the Ford Lightning and the SVT Cobra, and actually also did some work on the 0506 GT as well with a supercharger, I think specifically. But while that happens, and then 1998, about 5 years later, the Ford Expedition-based Lincoln Navigator proceeds to kickstart what we now know today as the luxury SUV market. Of course, we have the Lincoln Navigator, we have the Cadillac Escalade, we have a bunch of Mercedes SUVs, the G-Wagon, and the similar stuff, the Audi Q series, BMW X line, all that good stuff. Of course, that next year, or a couple years later, 2004, 0506 GT is released to celebrate Ford's 100th birthday. Fun fact on this one, actually, there's a little Easter egg in the headlights, where if you look at specifically the right headlight, you will notice that it says 100 in it. There's a little upright thing that symbolizes the 1, then 2 circles representing the zeros. 5 years later, in 2009, the Ford Taurus actually received the first EcoBoost engine. So nowadays, that there's several turbocharged engines that come with that. Of course, there's the turbo 3-cylinder that's found in these new Bronco Sports and the Ford Mavericks. There's the 4 cylinders that are found in the Mustang's base model. Then there's the big twin turbo V6s that are found in the Expedition, the Explorer, the F-150, etc. So fun little thing about that. 2 years later, 2011, Mercury's killed off, about 80 years after it had been started. Just due to declining sales and not much of a need for it anymore, because Ford was beginning to fill in the market where Mercury had been. 5 years after that, 2016, Ford GT famously returns to Le Mans to celebrate the 50th anniversary of, well, 1966. Uh, they, of course, put the twin-turbo EcoBoost V6 into it, which was a very controversial decision. I've talked to some people, and they all agree that it sounds more like a Ferrari than a Ford because, the GT before this had all, the GT40s had all had V8s in them, and the 0506 GT had also had a V8 in it. But this is the only one so far that's got a V6 in it, and very controversial decision, but, it is what it is. But I mean, it won in class at Le Mans, celebrating the 50th anniversary. They ended up making it to a road car that ran for about, the production of which ran for about 5 years. The last 20 of which actually were special editions. So what they did for the 2022 GTLMs, as they're called, is that they had taken the crankshafts from the Le Mans winning cars from 2016 and had ground them up and then 3D printed badges. So instead of having the traditional blue oval badge, they all had gray ovals. So the 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 logos, the emblems on the car on the last 20 GTLMs were all gray. There was not a single blue oval on any of them. Then 3 years after that, 2019, they released their decently controversial electric lineup with revealing the Mustang Mach-E, which, no, that's a controversial one. Also bringing back the Ford Lightning nameplate after, in the 90s, early 2000s as an electric F-150, which, again, very controversial, right? But on a brighter note, as I would like to end this off with, 2020, after about a 20 or so year hiatus, the Bronco was reintroduced as a, rival to the Jeep Wrangler. It's funny, the Wrangler and the Bronco are the only two modern cars on the American market that are offered with manuals, with the manual transmissions. And of course, the Europeans are having a laugh at this because, their cars are all manual over there. But yeah, I mean, that's part of the appeal of it, is that's a decently manual off-roader. But with that, um, thanks for watching. Hope you have a great rest of your day wherever you are. Um, don't forget, I guess obligatorily I have to say this, don't forget to like and subscribe. Um, I guess we'll do something special at 1,000 subs. I don't know. We'll see how that goes. But again, thanks for watching. Hope you have a great rest of your day. Giraffe out. Peace.